Oh man, what a fantastic time to have been a Crash Bandicoot fan these past few years. After a bunch of teasing and a seemingly eternal waiting period, the orange rat boy reared his goofy head in 2017 with the N. Sane Trilogy. But even then, when that collection released, I knew this couldn't be the only thing Activision had up their sleeves. As good as it was, and as much fun as I've had with the N. Sane Trilogy, it was fairly easy to see that this was their way of testing the waters to see whether or not there was an audience still out there for this kind of thing. And yeah, I mean, there definitely was. A lot of people seem to really like this one, despite its occasional problems, and it was a kind of no-brainer for them to start out with something that could appeal to long-term fans such as myself, as well as those that had never even played the Crash Bandicoot games before. I actually know quite a lot of people that were keen to play these games all over again, despite not really being into games that much these days. And then we got that excellent Crash Team Racing remake with all of the Nitro Kart content slapped in there for good measure. On top of that, we also got all of this new stuff thrown in after the game launched as well. Good lord. And we got the Spyro Reignited trilogy. This was kind of sandwiched in between those other two Crash games, and as far as the main games are concerned, Spyro always was more my kind of thing, so I definitely had my fun with that collection as well. And of course, a knock-on effect of all of these games doing so well is all of the random merchandise out there now. The little kid version of me would have absolutely killed for stuff like this when he was younger. Look at this. This is great. Anyway, like I say, I kind of had a hunch that all of this was eventually going to lead to something new, because you can only really get away with remaking old games for so long before people get bored, and that's exactly what we got with Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time. Excellent name for the game there, by the way. That works on so many levels. But yeah, obviously this was on my radar from the moment it was announced, and as of making this video, it has been out for quite a while now. But yeah, despite the fact I've already played through it, I'm going to play through it again so I can refresh my thoughts on the game, get a whole bunch of new footage, and generally get excited about playing it again. So yeah, let's go. Oh yeah, Toys for Bob did this one. I mainly know them for their work on the Reignited trilogy, but I really did enjoy that, so that's already a good start in my books. Obviously, Vicarious Visions were the ones that did the Crash remakes, but they were kind of busy with all of this stuff to be doing it this time, so yeah, we got Sideshow Bob on the job. Excellent work on the animated logo here, by the way. It's nice to see them keep up that tradition of Crash jumping around with the logos and stuff. Soon after that, we're straight in, and will you look at this game? I love this art style. Not just the character models, but all of the animations all the way throughout the entire game are super bouncy and stretchy, and pretty much every spoken word has this bouncy rhythm to it. These really do look like a bunch of cartoon characters, more so than ever before, and yeah, I definitely prefer how this game looks to the N. Sane Trilogy, that's for sure. I know that cartoony aesthetic was always the intention with the original game, so I am glad that that's still the case here, as some of the later games kinda dropped the ball on doing all of this, but I'd even go as far as to say that this is probably the best looking game in the entire franchise, but especially when it's in motion. I love how everybody moves around with such energy too. You know this kind of stuff is really good when you can pause the footage at any point and see these hand animated smears too. Oh my god, these are really fun to spot. Anyway, I kind of got off track there, even after the first freaking shot of the game, but yeah, as promised, this is a straight up sequel to Crash Bandicoot 3. And while we did kind of have that before at one point, this one really does go down the more traditional route of it literally being set directly after the ending of the previous one. Sure, it's 22 years after the previous one, but the bad guys are starting out in the same location they were stuck in at the end of Crash Bandicoot 3, so you get that really nice continuation of events. Anyway, so the bad guys finally make an escape from their prison by creating a big old space door, which kind of kills Uka Uka in the process, but the other guys walk on through the door and the game begins. Even from this first scene, we can see that Entropy is definitely going to be the one in charge this time around. He's the man with the plan and quickly steps up to be this game's big bad guy, which is a lot of fun to see. At the same time, we can see that Cortex has just really had enough of doing all of this, even mocking his new boss behind his back. This would seem out of place, but at the end of the third game, we did see him complain that he wants to just sit around on a beach because he's done with this, so yeah, I really like that they carried on with this. More of these space rifts start to appear, and the gang set off to find these 4 quantum masks in order to awaken Polycus, who will use them to send away the space pirates. Just kidding, that's obviously Rayman 2. But yeah, these guys will help fix the rifts and the universe before it falls apart or something like that. It's a simple enough plot to start out with, which is all I ever ask for these kind of things. But yeah, it's a pretty good bonus that the story all the way through this one is actually pretty good, and it has a lot of fun with the idea of time travel too. If there's one thing that I kind of wish Crash Bandicoot 3 did a lot better, well, you know, outside of there being way too many vehicle levels in that game, it's the actual traveling through time. In that one, it was just used mainly as a means of going to these different themed levels, but in Crash Bandicoot 4, you're hopping around all over the place, back and forth through time, and even traveling all the way back to a few days ago at one point. This is great. And all of this is happening with multiple characters crossing paths with one another. Like, holy crap, man, this is nuts. Anyway, there's actually quite a lot of ground for me to cover with this one, especially as somebody that's played pretty much every game in the entire franchise at this point, but yeah, what I did was I just made a big old list of things I want to talk about, and the first thing is going to be how it feels when you actually start playing. Once that first cutscene is over, you're thrown straight into the starting area on Insanity Beach, and from there you do that Crash Bandicoot thing. You know, you run forwards, you spin some enemies, and you jump on some boxes. The general gameplay loop hasn't really changed all that much, so if you're like me, you're almost going to instinctively fall into that trap of wanting to smash all of the boxes and collect everything you can anyway. Bonus levels make a return, with a lot of them almost being like platforming puzzles this time around, having you jump on certain boxes in the right order and activating switches in such a way that you don't checkmate yourself out of being able to do a clean sweep. These are actually a lot of fun, especially towards the end of the game. They really did get me thinking a bit. The occasional vehicle or animal riding sections also make a return, but thankfully nowhere near as often as the third game, which is good because, I'll be honest, I'm not really keen on how these control in Crash 4 either. They both feel a little bit too floaty and fiddly for my liking. But you do have these rail grinding segments which show up from time to time, which I did think were a fun addition, and like the vehicle stuff, there's no single level dedicated exclusively to them, but rather these sort of things just happen from time to time within the regular levels to break up the pace and also show off some of the cool scenery. To a much lesser extent, you've also got these wall running bits, which I think they're alright, but nowhere near the grand visual spectacle that the rail grinding parts can be, as well as them just occasionally being a little too fiddly to control for my liking, but I do like that it mixes up the gameplay without straying away from the platforming too much, like the rail grinding segments, so yeah, they're okay, I guess. Just not as good, but they're fine. In fact, this game has even less of that sort of vehicle-related stuff than ever before, which is already good on its own, but made all the better as the alternative to that this time is the multiple playable characters. This could be seen as a red flag, as it kind of was to me before the game launched, but no, it's all surprisingly well done. Each of them still focus on the running and jumping gameplay that Crash Bandicoot is known for, but each with their own twists on that playstyle, which I'll go into more detail later on. As for Crash, he does have his slide and double jump moves already from the start of the game, but there's definitely a mix of familiar and new ideas here, which I'm already liking so far, even 2 worlds into the game. Easily one of the most noticeable differences is the way the levels actually unfold this time around. Back on the PS1, every level was laid out in such a way to hide any unloaded areas and generally keep the polygon count low in order to keep the game running smoothly. This is why a lot of levels, particularly in the very first game, were very tight corridors. And while the Insane Trilogy didn't suffer with those technical limitations, it was a straight remake of those games in its design, so it did end up looking and feeling very similar to them. Maybe some extra shrubbery on either side of those corridors and some small details here and there, but it's almost like a shot-for-shot remake once the gameplay does actually begin. I'm not saying that was a bad thing, because I mean that was the point of the Insane Trilogy after all, but the point I'm trying to make is that it was necessary for the kind of remake it was, despite being on way more powerful hardware. I guess that's kind of why I like the Reignited Trilogy so much, because it does have all of this extra detail everywhere you look, and you are free to look at them as you please, but again, that's because the original games were designed that way anyway, so that's kind of why I always sway towards Spyro. This time with Crash though, in making a brand new game, it means there's no such restriction, so the levels can be way more open. Not so much in the same way Spyro is open, but more so in the way the camera moves around to show off these locations from all kinds of different angles. All the while, it's still about that focused linear platforming gameplay. So yeah, this really does end up being a treat for the eyes at times. Maybe a little too visually busy easy for me from time to time, but that really doesn't happen all that often. One area I did feel kind of got overlooked in that aspect though was the bonus stages. Not so much the actual stages themselves, but the transition to them, as every single one this time fades to black and then fades back in at the bonus stage. While it wasn't very often, I really did like the ones from Crash 2 and 3 where the bonus area was actually within the same camera shot you were already on, but you literally never get that here, which is a real shame. Would have been cool seeing at least some of them in the background of some of the wider shots like this. I actually did play another game recently with New Super Lucky's Tale that does this too, and it was one of the things I actually made a note of, how it was kind of similar to some of the levels in Crash 2 and 3. And then Crash 4 comes along and literally never does this. Oh dear. Guys, even the Wrath of Cortex managed to do this. In Jak and Daxter, when you can see locations way off in the distance, that is something I love to see, even on a smaller scale, like seeing bonus stages and death routes within the same shot that the camera is already on, but Crash 4 never does that, at least for the bonus stages and gem routes or whatever. It does do this for so much else though, so you get these cool angles where you can see upcoming areas, or even when you're on a grind rail and you can see the place where the rail ends way off in the distance, or even below you sometimes. It's really dynamic, just not for the bonus stages or anything like that, which is the reason this specific thing kinda stood out to me. I mean, this sort of thing doesn't really affect the game all that much, and to be honest, given how challenging some of the bonus levels are towards the end of the game, it is pretty good that you can just jump on the platform and it will take you straight to the bonus level, but I mean, they were able to do this kind of thing back on the PS1, so I think the occasional seamlessness with an optional skip button isn't really that much to be asking for, but whatever. Anyway, so what else have I got to ramble on about here? The map screen. I don't really have that much to say other than I do really like it. It presents the levels to you in a linear setup, which some people might think is a throwback to the first Crash game, but I don't think so. I think this was done in order to let the story play out in a more natural way, and to have story events happen more often than ever before. Like, in this game, we've got cutscenes for the arrival of all of the new dimensions you visit, with every boss encounter you have, as well as a few here and there just to show what the villains are up to, and it all sort of plays out like a long cartoon show. I don't think this amount of storytelling would have really worked with the old warp room setup, as everything told here is in direct relation to where the characters are and where they're heading next, so yeah, this works just fine for me. But yeah, I guess it is also kind of like Crash 1. Except this is better. So, you'll go through most of these levels as Crash or Coco, and their moveset is actually really good, I feel. It does take a bit of getting used to though, as things are a little different. Not too much, but things like Crash's double jump does feel a little bit heavier, and the slide in particular feels completely new. Not in a bad way though, as once I got used to it, I really did like what Toys for Bob did here. This time around, if you slide off a ledge, you will get quite a lot of coyote time, where you're still able to jump out of the slide after going off of a ledge. You could do this before to some extent, but gravity would kick in, but not anymore. This is a lot like Donkey Kong's roll move in Donkey Kong Country, except you get a lot more of a straight line when going off a ledge here in Crash 4. In fact, in general, this game kind of reminds me a lot of Donkey Kong Country Returns, in the way that it's an old series that's been brought back to life years later by a different studio that did make quite a few changes, but did also respect what the older games did, and yeah, I kind of get that feeling with Crash 4 in a lot of ways. One thing that is pretty easy to notice is the general movement, which I feel is really well done. I always used the analog stick for Crash 4, as it's definitely the most precise way of playing, even in the 2D segments, which was a surprise to me. For me, one of the things that Crash always had going for it were those moments of platforming where you need to land on the boxes one after another, and over time you'd gradually make yourself a bigger and bigger gap for you to potentially fall down. This is the game that does it the best out of all of them for that kind of stuff. It is so much fun bouncing around back and forth and hitting all of those boxes in a row, and sometimes having to do them in a specific order, all with the extra reach that you can get from just timing your slides and jumps and double jumps to make the most of them. There's also an entire set of optional levels that are completely dedicated to this sort of thing too, and I'm so glad they're here because they are so much fun. As you play through the different dimensions, you won't unlock super moves anymore as you did in the previous games, as they've been ditched in favour of the quantum masks. Unlike the other Crash 4, these guys are on your side, and as you rescue each one throughout the game, they'll occasionally show up for specific segments that rely on their powers to help you get by. Lani Loli is the first mask you come across who lets you pop objects in and out of existence, which makes for some really satisfying platforming and grind rail sequences. Akano is the next mask who gives you an infinite spin move that also lets you jump higher and fall downwards a lot slower. This one isn't as exciting to describe, but again, I did like some of the sequences where you have to time your use of it perfectly to make jumps last as long as they can. After that, we've got Kapunawa, who gives you the ability to briefly slow down time. This is probably the most cliche ability of them all, but I really did enjoy using it. It's mainly used for jumping on things that are moving too quickly, but it also does a massive slap in the face to the Wrath of Cortex by letting you run and jump on nitro crates before they explode. And yes, this is actually used quite a lot once you find her too, so yeah, screw you sneaky shoes, get out of here. And lastly, there's Ika Ika, this happy and sad guy that can flip gravity around. I don't really think there's much to explain here, but I felt this was a lot better in the 2D segments than in the 3D corridor-styled ones. I just kept feeling like I couldn't really judge the angles very well when upside down in the corridor sections for some reason. But overall, I really like these guys. Not only are they actual characters that you meet and need to find in order to progress the story, but they were added into the gameplay pretty well too. Like I say, once you find each one of them, they do appear quite often from that point on, which saves the disappointment of you getting a new power given to you and then basically having no use for it ever. That said, it is a bit of a shame that Aku Aku gets totally pushed out of the story this time. I mean, I get that the focus is on the new masks and that Lani Loli is a great side character that tags along for the entire journey, but come on man, it's Aku Aku. I really like this guy. He's already aware of who the quantum masks are and Lani Loli recognizes him, so it would have been cool to see his reaction to meeting up with some of his older friends again, but he just kind of disappears after the opening cutscene until he shows up again towards the end of the game, which is a real shame, because, like I say, this guy's really cool. I've always liked Aku Aku. I would say the same about Uka Uka not really showing up, but I didn't really feel the story in Crash 4 needed him this time around, as we ended up getting a much better villain later on. Speaking of which, the boss fights. I'm not going to show any of the later ones, as these kind of things are fun to figure out and do in the moment, but all of the major bosses this time around involve doing some actual platforming, with most of them having you also mix that in with one of the masks that you've recently got your hands on. You do have this one mini boss which isn't an established character and also happens at the end of a jetboard level. What is going on here? This is terrible. As for the good guys, yeah, we've got a whole bunch of them this time, some of which you play as, like this alternative dimension version of Torna, as well as Dingodile and Dr. Cortex himself, and for the most part, I really like these too. My thoughts on these are very similar to the boss fights in the sense that they all don't stray that far away from what I came here for in the first place. You know, that box-smashing, level-winding 3D platforming gameplay. Here, we just have 4 different flavors of the same kind of thing, so you're not going to have a situation where you see one character and automatically know that it means a vehicle level. These extra characters are all set up throughout the story, and once you encounter each one in order to unlock them, I guess, you can go back and look at some of their levels pop up alongside the regular ones that you've already played. This means that you get all of this really neat time travel crossover storytelling. There's a lot of this sort of stuff, and it's probably my favorite thing about how these levels were implemented. It's kind of like Back to the Future Part 2, but with Crash Bandicoot characters, so you get all of this time travel malarkey, which put a massive smile on my face. This is so much fun. This kind of stuff is what I mean when I say Crash 4 does the idea of time travel a lot better than Crash 3, because as well as it being an excuse to have a bunch of different level themes like it was before, there's also a narrative to justify all of it every single time it happens. It really does reach its peak towards the very end of the game, but I'm not going to talk about any of that just yet because I'll just bunch all of my spoilery thoughts towards the end of the video in its own section, so don't worry about that. As for playing as these extra characters, Torna has mostly the same gameplay as Crash, but with a grappling hook and a wall jump move. I think hers are probably the least interesting to talk about though, because outside of using it to take out enemies, the grappling hook is very situational, and the wall jumps kind of feel a bit awkward to pull off for some reason. It feels like there's a delay whenever you try and jump off the wall. I don't know, I'm just not really keen on this. Dingodile's levels are all about moving forward, doing a bit of platforming, but also using his vacuum cannon thing to suck up TNT crates and blow stuff up, and avoid getting hit by ranged attacks. I do like this for the most part, but I've never really been a big fan of controlling the direction you fire a gun by also moving the character in that direction. It kind of reminds me of Jak 2 and 3 and how that handled guns, which for me at least isn't really ideal, but it's not really that big of an issue considering it was done this way to avoid it becoming too much of a third-person shooter, which would have been way worse. So, I mean, I am okay with this, it just does feel a bit fiddly at times. I do like the way he double jumps though, by using the vacuum gun. It's a nice detail that he uses the thing he's already carrying to do the double jump, as well as it just feeling good to do, as you do have a little window of being able to hover around a bit. But my favourite thing about Dingo Doll is his personality this time, and seeing what this guy has been up to all this time. Instead of being a bad guy, he just kind of settled down after the events of Crash 3 and opened up a restaurant. And he's really proud of it too, he advertises it on TV and everything. Unlike Crash, Coco and the rest of the gang, his journey through the multiverse is also completely accidental, with him just sort of stumbling his way through rifts and trying to find a way home. I've never really considered Dingo Doll to be one of my favourite characters in this franchise, and I never really did want to play as him in things like Crash Team Racing or anything like that, but man, his personality is so good in Crash 4. His design is super fun too. Look at him, he's a big dude that likes his food. It probably says a lot about me that I kind of find him relatable at times too, because whenever I'm in a situation that I don't want to deal with, the only thing I ever want to do is just go home and not deal with any more bullshit, and that's the entire point of Dingo Doll's story in Crash 4, so yeah, I really like him, he's good. I also like seeing the accidental ways he's interfering with Crash and Coco's journey too, like, this is just a ton of fun. Cortex's gameplay is probably the most different to Crash's out of anyone, and I suppose that makes the most sense really, because he is the exact opposite of Crash. But yeah, instead of a double jump, he has his blaster, which can turn enemies into static or bouncy platforms, as well as do this dash move mid-air. Because of this, his platforming gameplay feels more like a puzzle compared to everybody else's. It's a little slower paced, and it's kind of fun using the different types of platform in the right places and in the right combination to find as many of the boxes as you can along the way. Honestly, I find Cortex's gameplay a lot of fun, but only when it's in these 2D segments. Again, same as Dingo Doll, I kind of find it a bit fiddly aiming the gun when you have full 3D movement in these sections, because you have to move in the direction you want to fire the gun, whereas the 2D sections eliminate that entirely. So yeah, if I wanted to see more of this style of gameplay, it would definitely be more of these 2D segments. I really like this. And again, it's really fun seeing his perspective on some of the things that happen in the main levels too, like what leads up to this death trap when playing as Crash. All of these characters, I would say, are pretty fun and a nice change of pace from the main gameplay without veering way off into the nonsense that other games did. Plus, you only ever actually have to play as these characters maybe twice throughout the entire game. After that, all of their levels are optional, so it's up to you as to whether or not you want to see more of what they have to offer. The only real downside to me is that all of those optional levels are more like half levels, not because of their length, but because you only play as the other character up until the point they cross over with Crash, where from that point you'll just play as him again for the rest of the level, which kinda sucks. Sure, the box placement is a little different this time around, but still, I would much rather have just had a full level as the other character, see how they cross over with Crash, and then move on, because as they are here, you don't even get bonus levels as them, and that's a shame, because I think you could have got some really interesting ones with Dr. Cortex and Dingo Doll in particular. Aside from that, yeah, I mean, as far as gameplay is concerned, I don't really have that many problems with this game, to be honest. As you go through all of the levels, there's a whole ton of things to collect and unlock, with the most common thing being the gems. Every level has at least 6 of these to begin with, and you get them by finding a hidden one in each level, collecting a certain amount of Wumpa Fruit along the way, smashing all of the boxes, and getting through a stage without dying more than 3 times. And getting these isn't too bad, to be honest. I kind of like using the costumes that you can unlock for getting the gems as a reason for trying to find as many of them as I can, but only where that's possible, because I will admit some of these box placements, man, they just seem needlessly cryptic. Some of these more hidden boxes wouldn't have been so bad if there was some Wumpa Fruit pointing in their general direction as a hint to the player, because that has been done in this series before now, but here I swear most levels have a handful of hidden boxes in the most bullshit of places, so if you're really gonna try and complete this game, then good luck to you, I guess, because it's pretty freaking tricky. And the difficulty of this game does kind of go hand in hand with discussing how lives are handled this time, which some people have made a really big deal about this, but I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's one of the easiest decisions in the world. But yeah, you can either have the modern mode where you have infinite lives, or a retro one where you have a fixed amount of them. And for me, as someone who is very familiar with these games, I picked the modern mode, and I would recommend everybody do that, really. The main thing for me is that these levels are much longer than anything else we've ever seen in this series before, at least when we compare them to the original games, so I would hate to have to redo an entire level just because I messed up one jump using a mechanic I hadn't quite gotten used to using yet. It's not so much about the difficulty, but the convenience of play. After all, this game is 22 years after the one it's supposed to be a sequel to, and I am 22 years older than I was back then, so yeah, as a working adult, I definitely appreciate a game not wasting quite so much of my time with this sort of stuff. I don't think having unlimited lives immediately makes this game any easier, it just means you're able to try again without being interrupted quite so often. And there's plenty of other games out there that do this really well as examples, so yeah, this isn't exactly something new. But I guess because it's the first Crash Bandicoot game that's ever offered this, yeah, people have kind of got up in arms about it, and I don't really know why. It's still brutally difficult at times, but it does give you as many chances as you need to learn about the obstacle with each try in your own time. And besides, you still have to die less than 3 times in order to get that bonus gem anyway, so there's still an incentive to not die. And even in the original games, I would always reach a point where lives became almost irrelevant anyway, so yeah, I don't really think this makes much difference, to be honest. Anyway, that's pretty much the gist of what I wanted to talk about with the gameplay. There is actually one more thing I can bring up, but I'll talk about that later on, because now I've got to talk about the story of Crash Bandicoot 4. It's about time, because it does actually have a pretty fun story that I wouldn't want to unintentionally ruin for anyone, so if you don't want to know what happens towards the end of the game, then just skip on ahead to the time I've provided and everything should be fine. But, I mean, I'm pretty late to the scene when it comes to making a video about this game, so I don't really feel bad about talking about spoilers, so yeah, you've been warned. I'm gonna pretty much say what happens at the end of the game now. Okay, so, generally speaking, the story for this game is fantastic and way more fun than it had any right to be, really. And like I've said many times before, I don't normally ask for much with these kind of games, but the fact this story is so good is definitely a cherry on top. It's really fun to see these characters doing something new for a change too, instead of just looking new but having the same story as before. So, with the Doctors, led by Entropy, set on ripping apart and taking over all of time and space, and the Bandicoots travelling through the multiverse to catch up to them, we eventually come up against Dr. Cortex, and upon beating him, he shows just how much he is sick and tired of doing this over and over again. It's around this time we see Entropy do what I was kind of expecting him to do and friggin' abandon Cortex in favour of a new partner he's found, with the plan being to completely erase all of the timelines and start over from scratch. This is such a good move, as I always thought Entropy didn't really care all that much for Cortex, and especially now he's left Uka Uka for dead at the start of this game, so yeah, Dr. Cortex ends up teaming up with the good guys and even starts to make plans for his newfound direction in life, like having a good guy lair inside of a volcano someday. The best part of all of this though is that Entropy has teamed up with an alternate dimension version of himself, who's probably even more evil than he is. The presence these two have together is so good and really threatening too. Femtropy here even outright mentions the time she was able to kill another version of Crash and Coco a while back. I did not know I needed a Crash Bandicoot game of all things to get this dark, but I'm glad it does. It definitely offers an interesting story that hasn't been done in the series before. Honestly, these two are probably the best villain setup the entire franchise has ever seen, and I really like it, which makes it almost criminal to see that they just get thrown through a space hole like 2 levels later, and you literally don't see them again after that. I don't even know if I can express how disappointing that was to me. If they'd maybe just taken this one world further so we had a second fight against them and got to see even more of their evil plans in action, it could have been something really special, so I kind of get the feeling this is obvious bait for another sequel, but I just really wish we got to see more of these two on screen together. But that said, I am glad that this all came as a surprise to me though. Apparently this Femtropy was one of the first things that got leaked a long while back, but it totally went under my radar. I had no idea this was coming, so it was a great plot twist. After that, the good guys go off and celebrate, but you can see Cortex is definitely thinking about doing something, and then he does. He opens up a time rift and goes back to 1996. Yes! This is like Avengers Endgame, but Crash Bandicoot. And here we see him trying and failing to convince his younger self not to create Crash in the first place, breaking the endless cycle of fighting, but in a different way to just becoming a good guy, because he clearly doesn't want to do that. And oh man, I had a massive smile on my face face the entire time. This is so good. I do kind of wish they used a different model for his younger self, but one neat detail is that the hologram for the 1996 Cortex uses the same kind of floating projector that he had in Crash Bandicoot 2. I spotted that straight away in the background despite it being so small, and I just thought it was really cool. And some of these levels on Cortex Island and in the castle are freaking great. They're easily some of the most challenging ones in the entire game, but I loved that challenge. There's this one sequence in particular that has you use all of the masks in quick succession, and it's an absolute roller coaster that seems almost impossible at first, but once you nail that pattern, oh man, I felt like a platforming god when I got past that part. The boss fight against Cortex at the end of the game is alright, but it's also fairly easy compared to all of the levels that lead up to it, so while it's thematically brilliant, it's just kind of easy to understand and pull off. You just wait for these things to pop up from out of the ground and then jump on them a few times, and that's it. The same can be said for the Entropy boss fight too. It's a really cool idea for the stage to be set up like this, and like I say, it's arguably the best villain setup this entire series has ever seen, but the actual level that all of that plays out in isn't really all that great. I do stand by the fact that these aren't outright bad or unfun bosses though. I just think the stakes could have been raised a little higher by this point, considering that the levels leading up to both of these are kind of difficult, but these weren't. They're pretty easy. After you do beat Cortex, you get a fun ending which directly ties into the opening of the very first game too, showing how it was Crash all along that caused the machine to reject him in the first place. I mean, yeah, this is pretty stupid, but my brain is constantly thinking about things like Back to the Future and Avengers Endgame when it comes to time travel, so I really enjoyed seeing that. That was a lot of fun. The only thing left to do after that is full completion, which from what I've seen online has caused a bit of a stir to say the least, and yeah, I'm definitely not going to bother with this. Some of those box gems with the bullshit placement of the boxes themselves, plus the fact you have to complete entire levels getting all of the gems in one go without dying once, and having to get all of the platinum relics for the time trial mode? Yeah, no thanks. That's not even mentioning the fact that there's an inverted mode that you can unlock halfway through the game, which basically makes you replay every single level in the entire game in mirror mode, doing all of those things again a second time, but with these weird filters applied to the game visuals and gameplay itself. Some of them are kind of cool, like this sonar one, but others felt absolutely horrible to me. You've got this comic book one that makes text pop up and actually get in the way of your platforming, and others can affect the speed or gravity of the controls, which just felt horrible. This was a real turn-off for me ever wanting to complete this game properly. Also, as diverse as some of these visual filters are, surely one of them should have been a retro-styled one where all of the environments revert back to looking like PS1 graphics. I thought that was fairly low-hanging Wumpa fruit, but the closest we got to that is this pixelated filter, which, oh man, this ain't it, my dude. I could do this using Sony Vegas. I mean, you've even got these cool-looking retro costumes, so for just one of the worlds, the inverted levels could have looked like this, which would have been such a good throwback. But anyway, in terms of actually completing this game, from what I've seen online from when I looked it up in its entirety, the actual ending you get for doing all of that busy work is absolutely not worth the effort at all. For me, I quite like rewards that you can use within the game, and the unlockable costumes that you can get from collecting gems is that kind of incentive I need to do a little better here and there. And yeah, while I don't really like the inverted mode versions of every level, they do come with their own sets of gems to give a little bit more wiggle room to earn most of those costumes, so yeah, I think this will do for me. My goal is probably going to be to just chip away at this game and unlock as many of those costumes as I can, because I'm pretty sure I'm never going to complete this game, and I'm fine with that. And it's totally fair enough to those people that do want to complete it, because you should just have as much fun as you want with your games, because that's all I do, and that's all anybody should do. So, I had quite a lot to say about this one, huh? I guess that's what happens when I spend several months dilly-dallying and then play through a game twice before talking about it, but yeah, aside from the occasional problem here and there, I think this is a fantastic game. You've got an excellent story and a set of gameplay styles that really do feel like a genuine follow-up to those old classics, all whilst learning from the games that have happened since then to throw away some of those old ideas that may not have worked so well. All the while, this game has its own charm, excellent controls, and a really good soundtrack. So yeah, we've got an excellent game on our hands right here as far as I'm concerned. If you liked the original Crash Bandicoot games, I'm pretty sure you're going to get something out of this one. And on the off chance you don't like what you see, I would say it's still worth a go at some point, maybe when it gets cheaper, but yeah, in an almost exact copy of what I said when the Insane Trilogy first came out, I'm really hoping Spyro gets this treatment next, because man, I would love a new Spyro game. But before that happens, and in order to 100% complete this video, you do actually have to go back and watch it again in inverted mode, so yeah, we better get started. Hey, thanks for reaching the end of this video that took ages to make. There's not really much I can do about that, but yeah, if you want to hear more of my random bullshit, you can follow me on Twitter, I guess, or throw me a couple of dollars here and there on Patreon, as it always helps out. But yeah, I hope they make Spyro 4 next, otherwise I'm going to go to Toys for Bob myself and kick some ass.